Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kirby Goff. I'm a research assistant with the Association of Religion Data Archives, and I'm one of the co-creators of our course, Exploring Religion. Today, I'm joined by a special guest, Dr. Orit Avishai, for our module on religion and gender. Dr. Avishai is professor of sociology at Fordham University. Through ethnographic research, Dr. Avishai explores how ideology and culture shapes social institutions, cultural practices, and politics. She's written extensively on religion, gender, and sexuality, covering topics such as breastfeeding and the politics of motherhood in the United States, gendered and sexual regimes in Israeli Jewish Orthodoxy, women in conservative religions, feminist knowledge production, and the marriage education movement in the United States. So quite a few really interesting topics. We're really excited to have Dr. Avishai with us today. And she's currently writing a book called A Gender Lens on Religion. So welcome, Dr. Avishai. We're glad to have you for our course on exploring religion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So why don't we get started? Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your research, and your teaching.
Okay, wow, that's a lot. So the interesting things, and I think this is important for students to hear, I came to sociology via law. I was in my early life, thought that I was going to be a lawyer and got not one, but 2 degrees in law. And then started reading some sociology and decided that I needed to take a different route. So for me, that's an important life lesson for young people. As you read off my research interests, yes, I have a lot of different research interests. Some of them focus on religion, some of them are religion is kind of in the background, but I'm very much sort of a grounded ethnographer. So that means that kind of look at the world, I look at phenomena, I think, wow, that's really interesting. What is going on? And then I enter what we call, ethnographers call the site, and then the questions and the theories and the interpretations emerge from there. So some of these have focused on religion, some of them have not. I teach at Fordham University, which is a Jesuit Catholic university in New York. I teach courses in a variety of courses in sociology and what we call WIGS, which stands for Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. I teach on gender theories. I teach courses on religion, gender, sexuality. I teach a lot of introductory courses and courses on inequality and identity. And as of last month, I submitted a book manuscript to NYU Press that is titled Queering Orthodoxy, The Battle for Judaism's Soul, or Straight Soul, which is about Orthodox Jewish activism and experiences of LGBTQ Orthodox Jews. So that's
wow. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about kind of being a grounded ethnographer. I know, in our course so far, students have visited congregations kind of as part of one of their activities and written about that. And I'm sure they had, that they will have had all sorts of observations, phenomena. What's going on here and why is that going on? And, that's just, as you say, it's just a small part of kind of an ethnographic approach to sociology. So I'm hoping that everyone will, be inspired by that, as well as just kind of learning a little bit more how to do it.
Yeah. My message about ethnography is always just go and look around and try to leave your biases and assumptions at the door, because you have many. And I mean, and I speak from experience. I had many when I approached my various field sites. And just soak in it and ask a lot of questions. The answers are, I mean, they're not less important, but in the beginning, they're less important. It's knowing the kinds of questions to ask.
That's great. So we're talking a little bit, we're talking about religion and gender today. And two of the biggest questions in the research on gender and religion, for better or for worse, are why women seem to be more religious than men. Um, what conditions are women maybe not more religious than men? And also, second, why women join traditional religious groups that tend to place limits on them. So, a couple of questions for you, just from your vantage point and your research. Uh, why do women tend to be more religious than men? And what do we learn from these trends, especially the cases where that might not be true?
So it's interesting. So this first question, why do women tend to be more religious than men? And I I have not personally studied this question. The way I come to this question is from a perspective of a critical perspective of a gender scholar, and I will explain what that means in a minute. And my gut reaction when I hear this question is, why is this interesting and why does this matter? And let me break this down a little bit. As a gender scholar, so I'm a scholar of gender and religion, which means that kind of I meld these two together, but I draw from theories about religion in sociology and outside sociology, and the same goes for gender. And gender scholarship is very much grounded in understanding how the world is gendered, how people are gendered, and how gendered ideas and ideologies and what we call gender scripts, right? So ideas about, what women and men are, and those who embody these social positions should act. And from the perspective of gender scholars, right, all of these are a product of history, of culture, of power dynamics. So why am I going there when you ask me why are women more gendered, more religious than men? Because there is an assumption there, right? There's an assumption there that everyone approaches religion in the same way, right? That everyone should be doing religion, should be interacting with this social institution that we call religion in the same way. And from the perspective of a gender scholar, let me add one more thing. Gender scholarship is also very much attuned to intersectional perspectives, meaning that we think not only in terms of sort of gender location, but also how it intersects with other aspects of our identity, sexuality, race, class, but also social ability, age, and of course, religion, right? So how people experience and interact with this thing called religion is a product of all these different things. Okay, so that's one part of my response. The other part of the response is, why do women tend to be more religious than men? Well, it depends. So in the United States, when we look at Christianity, and when we define religiosity in a particular way, for example, praying, then women seem to be more religious than men. But if we critically examine how we define religiosity, if we expand our lens on who we are looking at outside of these groups, then we actually see all sorts of things. Let me give you an example. And the thing with Christianity, before I give the example, right? Christianity is very much a belief-based, right? And prayer and personal prayer, and it's sort of which you can do anywhere, right? You can do in your home. You can that is very much the model for how we think about religion. So here's my example. A few years ago, a researcher consulted me because they were about Judaism, which is one of my areas of expertise, that they were going to test this question of religiosity in the Jewish context. So they showed me, a list of standard measures that people are asked, or standard questions that people are asked to determine their level of religiosity. And it had a lot about prayer, and it had a lot to do about going to synagogue, right? Sort of occupying the physical space. And my response was, well, if you're going to ask these questions, you're going to find that men are more religious than women, right? In the Jewish context, because in the Jewish tradition, like in the Orthodox Jewish tradition, especially, for men, it is a religious duty to pray several times a day and to do it in community. Women are exempt, right, from this religious duty. Not only that, the spatial separation of men and women in synagogue is such that many women just don't feel welcome, so they don't show up. So if your measure of religiosity is how often people pray in community, well, you're going to find that men are much more religious than women. But if you ask other kinds of questions about the gendered practices women's gender practices, you're might find something very different. So that was a very long answer to saying, we need to, when we ask about why are women more religious than men, then, which women in which context. So in the Christian context in the United States, when we look at specific measures, women tend to be more religious than men. But then the answers go to places such as, well, religion is a social institution, right? It has, just like other social institutions, it is a product of, it is in dialogue with gendered sensibilities, gendered power dynamics. So one of the reasons that women might find meaning in religion, in personal religion, in religious communities is, if they live in a gendered world, and, that's where they might find sociability. If they're raising young children and they need a sense of community, that's one reason that might go there. I think one last thing, what drives me crazy there's a whole bunch of studies that ask, well, why are women more religious than men? And then they start debating, is it biology? Is it social structure? Is it a process of socialization? And in gender scholarship, I mean, the idea that biology would be an explanation for social relations, I mean, is so outdated. It's so out of whack with contemporary gender theories. So that's a very long way of sort of not answering the question, but making an argument for what, for really thinking about the questions we pose, the assumptions that we bring with us, and the lens that we bring us to ask these questions. And to understand social phenomena, to go back to our ethnography question, is to really place it within a larger social context.
Yeah, this is good because, so far in this module, we've read a little bit about kind of some of the, the basic sort of survey trends in gender differences in religion, primarily in the U.S. But we've also read a little bit from kind of a gender studies approach about doing gender, doing religion, and this is helpful, kind of as students are thinking about their relationship between the two, to think, well, what are we talking about when we talk about being religious,
Mhm.
and how do, maybe from a survey methods approach, how do our standard questions sort of lean towards sort of one gendered way of doing religion as opposed to another. You mentioned prayer, the difference between asking people about kind of sort of standard prayers, maybe in the case of Islam, the standard prayers, five prayers, five times a day, versus maybe kind of more extemporaneous prayers or private prayers. Those would differ for important reasons. And as you mentioned, visiting a religious service, whether it's a mosque or synagogue or a Christian congregation on Sunday, that's also going to differ, between genders depending on the context too. And
Mhm.
so I think it's really helpful as our students think about and try to make sense of what they've observed so far in this course. Now you talked kind of, I'm going to skip forward and then come back to the second kind of big.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I
Yeah,
got
this is great.
off.
Yeah, well, so we're starting to talk about kind of what it means to do religion and to do gender and to do those together. But that idea, I think, is maybe a little new. It might be a little new to students. Um, the idea that religion is not just something that is sort of kind of done to you or put upon you. It's also a way that you express. It's a sort of a performance. I know that's kind of one of the words that's used, as well as gender. It's performative. So could you talk a little bit more about that idea of like gender and religion being performative, and what are the consequences of thinking about it that way?
Right. So, and again, I will start with gender theory because that's where that idea comes from, right? So, I'm going to say current, although this is not very current. This is like the past 30 years, right? But, one of the major advancements sort of in gender studies, specifically to gender, but then, that you can implement across social identities, is the idea that it's not that we are, right? It's not that you are a man, you are a woman. It's that gender is something that we do, we become, we perform, right? It's not just something that's done on it, right? It's like baby is born, okay, there's the blue categories, there's the pink category, right? Okay, choose, like read the script, okay, that's like, life. But that these scripts themselves are written by us, right, by society. And B, that it is a performance, again, not in the sense, also in the sense that, before I got on this call, I engaged in all sorts of embodied, right, gendered performances, right? Look at my hair, right? So the idea is that we engage with this idea of gender, right, by, through our bodies. We do this all the time. We do this every day. We do it mostly without thinking about it. And we do it with vis-a-vis sort of social scripts. So that's a very, very basic way of thinking about gendered identities as something that we perform. What a bunch of us kind of started thinking around a decade ago, maybe a little more, is to bring that idea into religion. So to think about religion not as just something that, okay, here is what a Catholic is, here is what an evangelical is, right? Here is what a Jewish person is, but that, again, these identities are learned, right? They're performed. And through those performances, right, we do several things. We signal to other people, okay? So I'll go to the religious tradition that I know best, Orthodox Judaism. So if I want to communicate to the world, I am a practicing Jewish woman, what am I going to do? Well, if I'm married, then I might cover my hair in a particular way, right? In a particular way that will be distinct from a way that a nun would cover it, right? A Catholic nun would cover her hair, or a different way that a Muslim woman would cover her hair, but in a very distinctly Jewish way. Well, what am I doing there? I'm performing gender, right? Because people will read that as sort of a gendered practice. I'm also performing religion, right? And part of the idea is that you aren't, it's not that you just are Catholic, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, etc., but that your performances create that, right? So your performances create that persona, and that you engage with religion through those embodied practices. So prayer, right? Prayer could be something that sort of, okay, you take a script and you read it. But what if you think about it as something that as you read it, right, that is, you are affirming to yourself and to others, right? But you might be doing this on your own. You're affirming to yourself vis-a-vis that embodied practice. Yes, I am a Christian, right? And this is what Christian people do. And when you do this day in, day out, right? Again, especially thinking about Judaism and Islam that are very performative, right? They're very practice-based. Geez, I mean, you have endless opportunities in a day as a Jewish person to affirm your Jewishness, right? Every time you eat something, you say a sort of a prayer. There's a whole in Orthodox Judaism, the whole set of rules around intimacy. So all these ways, and there are a whole set of rules around menstruation. So for women to affirm their Judaism just by going about their days, there are multiple ways in which they engage with the tradition, affirming, reaffirming. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's, we tend to think about sort of the traditions or the practices or even the beliefs that we have is kind of maybe just naturally emerging from sort of just being natural to us, but they are things that we learn depending on our context, and those are, family context as well as broader social context. Now, I want to ask kind of one question a little bit deeper in this respect, just for students who are kind of new to this idea of things as seeming, things as important as religion and gender being performative. Um, Sometimes people can feel like, oh, does that mean they're meaningless, right? So maybe you could speak to, in what sense do people need to worry about that or not worry about that? And once you kind of come to that conclusion, kind of what should you think about?
That's a very important question. The fact we're not talking about a theatrical performance just to right to signal to the world, right? This is not like performative activism, right? So when we're talking about performing identities, we're not talking about sort of maybe in a cynical way,
Mm.
but we're talking about a way of approaching aspects of our identity that are done with and through our bodies. And they might not be conscious, right? So when I teach gender, I'll go there for a minute. I will invite students and I say, walk like a girl, walk like a boy, and students do this like ridiculous, like over performative, but there's a kernel to truth, right? Sit like a boy, sit like a girl, right? So there are ways of talking, there are ways of walking, there are ways of holding one's body, there are ways of dressing, right? So when we talk about performance, we're talking about practices that happen in and through the body, but not in a cynical way, not sort of strategically, but because people really think that that's what makes them, right? So in some Orthodox Jewish traditions, right, you will not see, right, if a woman is married, you will not see her outside of her household without some kind of hair covering, again, and that would depend on specific communities. So that is what they do, right? But it is the action of doing that also affirms and reaffirms for oneself, right? So it's not just a sort of a cynical strategic thing on the one hand, and it's not just oh, look at me. So it's a process of constant becoming, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's great. I like I like that sort of that term becoming, whether it's religious practices or religious identity or gender identity, um, it is a process of becoming, who you will be, right? Um, and I think it's, there's some meaning to that that's important to think about. Okay, let's shift gears. I want to go back to this second kind of big
Yeah.
question. Um, and in some of the research and also I think some of our readings, we looked at, well, why do women join or stay involved in religious groups that maybe from some perspectives deny them influence and independence? Um, this is kind of a big question, but I know it's something in yours and others' research on taking a gender lens on religion, gender. Um, this has been a question, it's been a question that people have explored. So um, could you kind of share, from your vantage point, maybe about this question and whether or not there are some other more important questions we should be asking?
So, I mean, it is a very important question, right? Here too, right? How we approach the question and the lens becomes very, very important. And I will say, I started my doctoral research looked at, and then I published a lot on that topic, was precisely about this question. centering specifically on Orthodox Jewish women and how they engage with Jewish menstrual laws, which comprise a huge body of sort of legal code. Orthodox Judaism is a practice-based, but it's also sort of very sort of legally organized. So a legal code around how to manage menstruation in the context of intimacy, as it's called, or of married couples. And the implications are huge for how women monitor sort of their bodies before, during, after menstruation, and the and sort of sexual intimacy between married couple, heterosexual married couples, right? The assumption is of heterosexuality. And as a secular Jewish woman, I looked at that and thought, whoa, right? Like, people really are still doing that in the 21st century. Why, right? I mean, I'm not going to go into all the nooks and crannies of these rules, but and then why are, like, educated women who are, like, studying with me in the university, how can they look at this body of literature, or at these body of laws and practices, which also frame menstruating women as ritually unclean, like, right? So it's this question, it's like, how does this even work, right? Sort of this paradox, right? And what I came up with, and when I started looking at the literature, is this paradox approach, right? It's like, there are all these rules, and then, like, don't they get it that they're being objectified? Don't they get it that they're being policed? Don't they get it that these kinds of rules are oppressive? Or so I did, like, as an ethnographer, as I said, I went to the field and I started asking sort of religious women, right, Orthodox women, well, like, what does this mean to you? And what that did for me is, it changed the lens and the question, right? Because one of the things that I came to realize, and again, there were a whole bunch of us asking similar kinds of questions. I would say somewhere in the sort of mid 2000s, or early mid 2000s. And part of it became a question of questioning our own lenses and assumptions that we bring into this. Okay. So yes, there are, like, these sort of Jewish menstrual laws, and there's a whole baggage of terms of ritual impurity and policing couples' relationships. But then you start asking, well, is that a problem, and why is that a problem? And are there other ways to think about ritual impurity that doesn't immediately lead you to thinking about oppression and patriarchy, and then even taking it one step further, thinking, okay, even if there is something that might look like oppression, are there other ways of thinking about gender dynamics within specific religious groups, and frankly within social groups in general, that would make us more sympathetic, or add other conceptual tools to thinking. I mean, not that oppression is good, but that people who are within this community don't think about these particular dynamics as necessarily oppressive. Right? So this question of why do they join, why do they stay? One answer is because, wait, why do they join, why do they stay when they are being oppressed? One answer is, well, they're not really being oppressed from how they experience their religious tradition. That's one. Another answer is, they're engaging, going back to what I said earlier about sort of religion and gendered religion being performative, because this is, through wearing the hijab or wearing a different kind of head covering, right? This is a process of becoming, right? It's not that part that they're just signaling to the world, I am a Muslim woman, I'm a Jewish woman. But it is or for, other, for men in various traditions, facial hair. So it's not just a process of indicating to the world, they are doing this because this is how they become, right? This is how they become, this is how they are. So that's another way of answering this question: why do they join? Why do they stay? And then another one is like, one of the reasons I'm drawn to ethnography as a way of studying the world as opposed to surveys, et cetera, is that when you are close to the ground, when you ask these questions, you start seeing a lot of variation, right? So what I saw in this particular field was, well, women were, yes, were following these menstrual laws, but they were also doing all sorts of other things. So this wasn't like, major big time resistance, let's bring down the house. Some did, but in small little ways, they were negotiating they were changing in small circumstances. So it's not that they were just like staying and doing and following kind of mindlessly, right? There was also a lot of activity. And I will sort of add as a postscript, I kind of looked at this. So I was in the field sort of doing sort of this research, these kinds of questions in the early 2000s. Fast forward 10 years, a lot has changed because of the small little things that women were doing, because they were starting, and even talking about sexuality, for example, was almost a taboo. And then 10 years later, women are starting to talk about it. They're starting to talk about their practices. They're forming Facebook groups to talk about this. 10 years later, things are changing, right? They themselves are starting to ask some of these questions, and therefore changing some of the minutia and some of the practices, but within the context of that religious tradition and what it allows. So again, a very long answer. Does it answer the question?
Yeah.
Why do women join and why do they stay? Because what we might think as oppressive, they may not see that way. B, because it gives them meaning, because it allows them to be, right? It allows them to be, right? This is what, if you are part of, of the green people, right? This is what the green people do. I will just say in parentheses, a lot of this work was not enabled, but an anthropologist who has unfortunately recently died, Saba Mahmood, was kind of the first to conceptualize, right, and kind of to change the lens, and to ask, wait, like, are we asking these questions because we are coming with a very secularist Western perspective on religious practices, right? Are we coming to this field with assumptions about what it means to be an individual in society? Are we privileging ideas about freedom and equality, right, in ways that almost force us to see these religious worlds through oppressive and paradoxical lens? And then what happens when we remove these assumptions? What becomes possible?
Yeah, those are great kind of insights. I wish that we had been able to read some of Mahmoud's book in our course, but perhaps the students can pick that up later.
That is for later. Yes, that is for much later. So yes, you would spend a whole course just trying to decipher that book. So no.
Well, this is a great, I mean, just thinking about these two questions about, religiosity as well as kind of women in conservative religions, just illustrate the need to kind of take a closer look, question your assumptions, and really listen to how people are describing kind of why they do what they do, how it's meaningful to them, as well as giving people space to think about, well, is this all good? Do I experience some tension or some problems here? And I think not just for understanding kind of in an academic sense why the relationship between gender and religion, but perhaps even for kind of intercultural or interreligious dialogue. This would be really helpful.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, taking a step back, just kind of wrap up our time, are there kind of any other big questions or big topics that you think still need to be explored when it comes to understanding religion and gender?
So again, I think most of what I will say is more about a lens. I mean, I think there are questions, but definitely sort of developing a lens for thinking about religion and gender, right? But as embedded, right? That we can't just think about religion and gender without attending to national context, without attending to, if we're talking in the U.S., to racial differences, right? And to class and to immigration status, right? Those are an age and location in the country, right? Those are, we can't just think about that in a vacuum. In gender scholarship, we call this intersectionality. In religion and sociology of religion, some are talking about complex religion. I don't know which, maybe that's sort of coming up in the course, but really thinking about the situatedness, right? And everything that I said about performing and becoming and being, now multiply that with all these different dimensions. So I think that is a very important lens I'm thinking. In terms of specific, and then I like to ask how questions, right? So, even with a question of why are women more religious than men? I'm like, well, can we ask how, right? How are women and men, for example, well, which women and men, but whatever, right? And I think sort of how just opens up a lot more questions than why, because it allows for nuances. In terms of specific topics, I am assuming that you're covering sort of white Christian nationalism in the course, maybe, and sort of the religion and politics lens, and understanding the extent to which those are intertwined. Again, it's happening in the US in a particular way. It's happening in other countries in other ways. In parentheses, the US way is being exported, right, as part of some cultural imperialism to other places and spaces. So just as one example, right? Homophobia and the ways in which people in various African contexts talk about religion, gender, sexuality is very much shaped by what's going on here in the US. So we're exporting that. So I think those are important questions. And in my mind, sort of the intertwinement of religion and politics, but in the particular ways that we're seeing now is one of the most important questions. And the answers there are to me are coming obviously from sociologists, but also looking at what's going on in religious studies and how religious studies scholars think about it. Is it that theology is driving ideology or the other way around? Well, some I don't know that if you're reading Anthea Butler, who's a religious studies scholar at Penn, but she has this very strong idea, sort of argument, that theological ideas about gender, but also race and other issues, what looks like theology is really ideology dressed up in theology. And to me, those are very, very important and potent and urgent questions. And again, other kinds of questions that I alluded to before is to look at the messiness and the how, right? So how people negotiate with in their daily lives, right? So it's very easy to look at, whatever religious tradition, and just say, oh, Catholicism says this, Islam says that. Well, Catholicism and Islam don't say anything, right? I mean, they don't wake up in the morning and have coffee and talk to people, right? It's like people, right? People populate these. So I think that that's always been important, but especially now, as a lens of understanding difference, etc. Yes, and I could go on, but those are sort of important lenses and questions in my mind.
This is great. Yeah, we are talking. We have a module on religion and politics, and we cover the Christian nationalism angle a little bit. We even have a module on kind of religion, conflict, and war, in which we interview a sociologist in Ukraine. So right now,
oh wow, okay,
Ukraine, and he talks about that a little bit as well. And as you mentioned, there's a totally a different dynamic in Ukraine compared to the U.S., even though some similar ideas are at work. So I want to ask just the last question here. You teach students regularly about gender and religion. What's kind of like the most important thing that you want students to understand and take with them about the relationship between gender and religion?
Wow, that's a really tough one for some reason. I mean, my approach is teaching sociology and to teaching, I'm teaching sort of in a liberal arts context, right? So what I always say to students in whatever class you take, right? I mean, we want you to both take away some concrete points of knowledge, right? So in this case, it's understanding gender dynamics and understanding, right, that gender and religion you can't just carve those out from the rest of social interactions, right? So religion works in gendered ways because the world is gendered, right? And people interact within religious traditions in particular ways because they come in with all these ideas about gender. So that's a concrete thing, but beyond that, I think of it, I guess that comes from a Jesuit tradition, right, of sort of the formation of the mind and a lens on the world and a language. So it is a language of seeing difference and understanding and appreciating difference, and also turning that to ourselves, right? So I don't think you can understand the dynamics without a gender and religion, for example, without a huge dose of humility, by which I mean question your own assumptions, right? Question your own assumptions, even about arenas that you think that you know very well in the back of your hand. Questions the assumptions that you come in with. The other thing is, I'm going to sort of say something that's going to sound contradictory about religion. On the one hand, from an academic standpoint, from sociological standpoint, right? Religion is not that sacred place, right? It is a space that we can study, that we can understand, that we can, ask all these big questions about how are people in the world, right? How do they form communities? How do they form power relationships? How do they form identities, right? So in one sense, it's not that sacred. On the other hand, it is unique and sacred in the sense that because for practitioners, right, there is meaning, right? There is meaning that maybe I cannot understand as emotionally or emotively as someone who identifies as a secular person. But to understand all these questions and all these dynamics, we have to understand people from their own standpoint. And for them, right, there is something sacred in that space. Yeah. And the other thing I will say, right, we mentioned a few books and other ways of thinking, and I could have rattled off a lot more. So always an invitation. Yes, we carve out knowledge into discrete boxes. Here you do sociology, and here you do anthropology, and now you're doing political science, and in this unit you're talking about gender and religion. And we have to do that because we can't talk about everything all the time. It gets too confusing. But always make connections. across units, across courses. Yeah.
Great advice. Yes. Well, thank you, Dr. Avishai. I really enjoyed our conversation, and we appreciate your taking the time to join us.
Thank you. I appreciate having been invited.
Well, that's it for this module on gender and religion, and we'll see you at the next one.